All right, it's 12 noon on the East Coast. I'd like to welcome everyone today to Distributed Security Incorporated's webinar, COVID-19 and Beyond, Developing Armed Proprietary Enterprise Security. DSI is a private security company. We are the creator of distributed security networks, and we train individuals and teams to actively defend life and property from violent threat. I'm Les Leslie, Vice President of Business Development for DSI. The topics today will be three. What kinetic threats do enterprises face in 2020? Replacing security theater with an active defense, and how to create an armed proprietary enterprise security force. By way of ground rules, I will ask all of you to hold your questions till the end. If you have questions that pop up during the course of the presentation, please type them into the text block in the dashboard. I'll sort those out and direct them to the pertinent subject matter experts to discuss at the end. At the conclusion of this webinar, each of you in attendance will receive a certificate of attendance, a copy of DSI's threat matrix, a recording of this webinar, and a trial membership to our online defense academy. On the panel today, we have Mike Smock, co-founder and CEO of DSI, Ron Danielovsky, co-founder, executive vice president, and chief instructor, Bill Talon, executive vice president of tactical operations, Randy Bartlett, vice president of strategic engagements, Dr. Chuck DeBoer, vice president of tactical medicine, and myself. Bill and Mike will be doing most of the lift today on the presentation.
All right, folks. Before we start talking specifically about emerging threats, we want to lay some kind of basic assumptions here. We want to clear up some misconceptions and some assumptions that people have about enterprise security. First, here we go. Myth number one that we'd like to dispel is that the cops, the police, will defend you, but the police won't be there. They have no legal obligation to defend you. That's been resolved in several court cases in recent decades. They're not going to be there at the point of contact when you need them, when and if you face a kinetic or a violent threat. They respond after the fact. The police pursue, investigate, and apprehend suspects. They write reports to support future prosecution. And all of that presence in a civil society provides some kind of deterrence against criminal violence, but they're not going to be there to defend you. In cities where there are large, capable police forces that are fully manned under normal conditions, effective police response to a violent incident typically takes at least 5 to 10 minutes. While we know that active shooter incidents, which are certainly high in our spectrum of potential threats against enterprises, active shooter incidents are usually over in well under 10 minutes. They're very rarely stopped by the police. The police cannot arrive, deploy, orient to a situation, and respond against the shooter before he's accomplished his goals and either escaped or taken his own life or prepared to surrender. So the police are not there for you. Myth number two is that technology will defend you, but technology in the form of electronic security systems provide the same benefit as razor wire and minefields and obstacles in a military context. All they do is delay an attacker. To some extent, that delay constitutes a form of deterrence. It discourages them from coming, but it doesn't do anything more in itself. No camera or alarm system or metal detector has ever stopped a bad guy with a gun unless it was backed by armed, alert, capable, and responsive defenders. Lockdown, I work quite a bit with schools, and I can tell you, especially in that context, lockdown technology and protocols cannot stop an attacker unless he's somehow identified well before he gains entrance. We have one marvelous example of that from a couple of years ago out in California, where a shooting began out in the community, and the gunshots heard a mile or more away from the elementary school caused that school to go into lockdown before the aggressor, who was intended, in fact, he was headed for the school. That was his primary target before he ever got there. So he was pretty much ineffective when he arrived at the school, but that was because they'd had 5 to 10 minutes to go into lockdown before he ever arrived. Most attackers don't announce their intentions that rapidly. Myth number 3 is that a retired cop as a uniformed security guard is going to defend you, but that's really probably not going to work very well either. Retired cops have a wealth of knowledge and experience, but they're usually not physically capable or prepared for sudden violence. When they were on active duty, most of them fired their issued weapon on a square range once or twice a year, and never in the course of their career at an aggressive human being. And in retirement, no matter what their accomplishments in their professional career, in retirement, their highest level of training generally decays steadily. Myth number 4 is the assumption that civilians cannot be trained to a level of proficiency in armed defense. But we at DSI especially know that this is not the case. We have many, many years of experience in training civilians as well as military, police, and government agency personnel. So I'm speaking from direct experience here. Every SWAT cop or special operator started as an untrained civilian. The initial and preliminary training that they had, either on the police or the military side, was tailored to untrained recruits, and none of that training produced a superhero. And the more advanced training that they later received is training that can be and has been duplicated and presented to civilians very successfully. A key element here is that an enterprise is never seeking to create a police officer or a special forces soldier. Those are very, very broad skill sets, and that's not what you need. What the enterprise needs is armed security operators who are able to quickly, safely, legally, effectively resolve a lethal force situation and save innocent lives. That's a very narrow skill set that doesn't involve arrest, apprehension, investigation, the full set of skills of a police officer or a soldier. It's deep and it's critical, but those narrow, deep, and critical skills, we can train them very effectively to anyone who is fit and motivated and willing to take on that role. Myth number 5 is that ALICE training or some similar form of active shooter training is going to defeat a violent threat. Well, we haven't seen yet where that has happened. ALICE offers very useful advice to participants for barricading an office or a classroom against invasion by an attacker, or for the difficult but sometimes important choice between locking down and evacuating during an attack. But despite what ALICE provides, which is the fun and catharsis of bombarding a role player with tennis balls, it doesn't teach an effective way to stop an armed psychotic killer from shooting people until he decides that he's finished. The Department of Homeland Security promotes the run, hide, fight paradigm, but run, hide, fight gets it exactly backward. If you're willing to fight to save innocent lives, then you should train, equip, and prepare yourself to do so effectively. Don't be like the heroic teachers in a school shooting who die standing in front of their students, protecting their students with their bodies because they have no other means of protecting them. And all they accomplish, despite their personal heroism, is that they die first. As enterprise owners and managers, you should be looking to develop a cadre of vetted, well-trained volunteers within your organization who are willing to defend innocent life. If you can fight, then fight. If you can't fight, then hide while others fight for you. And if you can't hide and there's no way out, and there is a way out, then you can run, again, while others fight for you. Myth number 6 is that this new trend across the country, red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders, that these will somehow prevent a violent attack, but they don't, or they haven't so far, because most active shooters do not reveal their intent before they act. Those that do reveal violent intent or tendencies toward violence are routinely ignored. Virginia Tech is a horrible but representative example of that. There are legal mechanisms already in existence across America to intervene in such cases, in spite of which there are many, many, many failures of people whose violent tendencies have somehow been flagged and identified, and no action is taken, even when the legal system does allow for the possibility. That result comes from normalcy bias and complacency. Those are aspects of human behavior that no new law is going to change. Every deterrent, every detection, every intervention program in existence, by definition, has failed at the moment the first shot is fired. And these shooting incidents happen on a regular basis. So I have very little faith in a new law changing human behavior to that extent. And beyond the case of the active shooter, the disturbed individual, terrorists and criminals of all sorts are far less likely to telegraph their intent and be intercepted by a law or program like this before they act. And myth number 7 is ACES training will defeat a violent threat, but no, it won't. What ACES programs do, and they can be very valuable and very useful from the standpoint of enterprise management, but what those programs do is they work the front end of the problem. They can help you enhance your prevention, early detection, and deterrence. But like many of the other approaches that we're talking about here, they become irrelevant and useless at the moment that an undeterred, undetected violent actor initiates his attack. Myth number 8, gun-free zone signs will prevent a violent attack. This is almost not worth the time it takes to talk about, because any common sense individual, I think, understands that the only effect of such signage is to assure a potential attacker that no law-abiding person on the premises will be armed and capable of resisting him. So your sign may as well say, unarmed victim zone, come and do with us as you will. So let's move on. Let's talk about kinetic threats and what enterprises are likely to face under current circumstances. First, since we founded DSI about 10 years ago, DSI has maintained that for the security of American enterprises and persons and communities, the past is not prologue. We've enjoyed, as you've seen, 200 years, give or take, of relative safety and security in this country as a result of these factors. A classically liberal social order, I use it in the historical perspective, a free market economy, individual freedoms, a rule of law, which has been challenged in a lot of ways, but has usually been resilient and stable and respective of our freedoms. That's the historical case, but those conditions have been changing over the last 2 or 3 decades, and we've all seen it. A historian could say that there are no new threats out there, only old ones repackaged, and there's some truth in that. But these old challenges in their new clothes are creating a very new threat paradigm for most of us. Normalcy bias is the tendency to believe that what we'll see in the future will not vary from what we've seen in the past. And it's a very, very powerful tendency that we're all prone to. The old normal is less and less relevant to us now, especially in our more challenged urban areas. Economic fragility, political polarization, increased lawlessness, really in the form not so much of spiking crime rates, but in just general disrespect for the law and for norms of civil behavior. And the decline, as mentioned earlier, in law enforcement presence and effectiveness. All of these things contribute to the new normal, which doesn't look much like what we've been used to in the past. Over those last 20 or 30 years, we've seen an increasing frequency of physical threats and violence directed against enterprise employees and assets. Still, they are, in the language of risk management, low probability but high consequence events. They don't really happen that often, But when they do, the consequences are sometimes enormous and not acceptable. So it's very tempting, again, to fall prey to that normalcy bias, to play the odds, to say the likelihood of an event of that magnitude happening here to us is so small that we're not going to change anything. And when we fall for that, we avoid the expense of real preparedness in the hope that those threats are not going to appear on our doorstep. We're only going to hear about them in the news. The alternative is security theater, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Large-scale threats to enterprises have followed man-made and natural events. For instance, Los Angeles, 1992, the Rodney King riots. The WTO protests in Seattle in 1999, which specifically targeted corporations. The civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Hurricane Katrina with the evacuation of New Orleans, followed by looting and collapse of civil order. The potential for those kinds of events, both man-made and natural, is steady or increasing. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, civil disorders of all types. Those are constants in our world. I know some of the participants here are located out on the West Coast, and for all of the popular attention paid to Southern California and the San Andreas Fault, if any of you all are from Washington State or Oregon, I'm sure you know a little bit about the Cascadia subduction zone and the enormous and imminent threat of earthquakes and tsunamis on an enormous scale up in the Pacific Northwest. What we see when we look at these from the standpoint of community and enterprise security is that managing even a localized crisis, like any of those examples I gave, requires enormous resources. For instance, when a major ice storm hit western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma in January of 2001, it took about half of the utility linemen and repair crews in the entire country to converge on that area and restore electrical service that was taken out by that ice storm. How do we as a nation respond to a more widespread event, again, natural or man-made? Well, I think we're going to see. We're now being tested by this COVID-19 pandemic to see how our healthcare system and other vital resources are going to react and how resilient they're going to be in the face of a nationwide crisis where we cannot concentrate our resources in a local area. This pandemic is not a black swan event. Most of you all are probably familiar with that metaphor. The black swan theory is something that Nassim Taleb popularized, and it describes an unexpected or hard to predict event of a large magnitude beyond the realm of what anyone expects. But truthfully, COVID-19 is not one of those. We've all lived through SARS and MERS and Ebola. And if you have any interest in human history, you know that pandemics are just part and parcel of the human experience. This one is a true pandemic. It's on a scale that we haven't seen since the 1918 flu, thanks to our population size and density worldwide, the speed and volume of international travel, and the effects of globalization on our economy. And so we have to look at both first order and second order effects. First order effects, illness and death from the organism, are in their early stages. They're increasing at an exponential rate. And we're not going to enter into the debate about best case versus worst case scenarios, but we know these effects are going to be fairly severe. The second order effects of COVID-19 and of our response to the pandemic are only beginning to be seen. And what they're going to do for all of us is contribute to social instability at a time when we are already less cohesive and less resilient than when we faced major challenges in the past. So in truth, we are entering uncharted waters. COVID-19 turns up the heat on what was already a stew of emerging threats. So So now we're going to take a turn and we're going to look at some of the common vulnerabilities and conditions that were already pre-existing, were already brewing, but that are being exacerbated by the pandemic and by its second order effects. First, the effect on plant and real property. The occupancy and activity on commercial properties is going to be affected by these things, rather obviously, okay? By the direct effects, which are absenteeism due to illness, by our isolation and quarantine measures. Lots of enterprises are shutting down or operating with reduced workforces. By interruptions in power, in fuel supply, in the supply chains that you depend upon, potentially interruptions in credit or in the demand for products and services. So plant may be shut down and vacant. It may be operating with a reduced workforce. It may be operating at an accelerated pace if it's involved in the production of vital goods. Transportation impacts. You're going to have workforce impacts both within your own enterprise and throughout your supply chain that will reduce your ability to obtain materials and components and to move product. You yourself will experience fuel shortages and workforce impacts, but the transport sector that supports you will also be affected by these, resulting in degradation of the speed and reliability of air and ground movement of goods. Okay? And then your own workforce, if it is dependent upon public transit or commuting by personal vehicle, then they're going to be affected by travel restrictions, fuel availability, and other infrastructure challenges. Inventory. Now, an enterprise may be engaged in production or assembly or shipment of high-value, time-urgent products, ventilators, pharmaceuticals, protective equipment. If you're involved in that or are going to become involved in that industry, you're going to be dealing with products which now require protection in transit and in storage. Secondary categories, food, fuel, essential expendables, have also become somewhat increased in their relative value, and not to dwell on it, but you see the so-called panic buying of toilet paper and the rush to strip shelves of their just-in-time inventory of food and household goods shows what happens in an event like this, which is really no different than what you see in hurricane-prone areas, when a storm is approaching, but now we see it nationwide. Also, through either voluntarily or through the Defense Production Act, some enterprises are going to find themselves repurposed to provide vital goods or services related to the pandemic response. And if you're in the business of producing luxury or non-essential goods or services, you're probably going to see much reduced demand, but your products will still be stores of value and they're still going to be attractive targets for theft. Your workforce, clearly, with great variations across the country and through the nature of your enterprise, but you're going to see your workforce either fully employed or reduced through furloughs, layoffs, or termination. You may have disgruntled current or former employees who may constitute a threat. The safety and security of your workforce is going to be a concern for the enterprise as well as for those affected individuals. And those concerns will be both physical and economic. They will be real and perceived because the psychological element is very, very important. First responders, we discussed this earlier, but it's something to remember. There are the numbers about absenteeism, the examples that we've seen. New York City was just 3 days ago, reported 11% of its officers out sick. In Detroit, it was 20%. Those are just snapshots. Obviously, the national media does not report consistently across the country, but as this pandemic moves on, you're going to see this kind of absenteeism, not just in police officers, but in fire, in EMS response, police presence, patrols, responsiveness to calls, which we already know is too slow to resolve most violent incidents. That responsiveness is going to be reduced further. And there's one other element, and that is societal trust. It's kind of an interesting area to explore if you have the time. It's a sociological notion that says societies that are homogeneous, cohesive, and stable under stress can weather these kinds of crises very effectively, because there's a great deal of trust from person to person and within a community. There's support for others who may not be family or close friends, but it's people pulling together and working together, and enterprises pitching in, and communities sustaining themselves through scarcity and hardship. But there are certainly areas in America where that kind of cohesiveness does not exist. There are communities where we do not have that level of trust and cooperation. You probably know if you are in such an area. One that I've been involved with in the past is for instance, and not to pick on them, but the Somali immigrant population in America is very localized in certain areas of the United States, and the Somalis who come over to America, and the vast majority of them are hardworking and socially conservative people, but they come over as members of a tribe, and their loyalty and their social trust, their mutual support network, consists of their family, their clan, and their tribe, and they don't cooperate with other tribes, much less with many aspects of the larger society. That's just the nature of their culture and their civilization, and this may change over time, but America has not been very good in the last few decades at assimilating newcomers. So this is a challenge that we have in some areas where we don't have cohesive communities that are going to pull together to respond to the crisis. There are familiar threats, things that we've seen and known in the past, that are going to become both more likely and more dangerous on those risk management scales under the conditions of this pandemic. We may see, we haven't seen it yet, but we may very well see civil unrest arise from scarcity or from outrage at government actions, at infrastructure failures, if they come, at access or lack of access to needed goods or wanted goods and services. And if that comes, you will see, as we always see, that mob action can become unfocused and unpredictable, but well, even that's not always the case. Those WTO protests in Seattle and Los Angeles, the Occupy protests, the Antifa events, the Oakland riots back in 2014, all of those targeted specific businesses and corporations. We also have the possibility of terrorist action by internal enemies or external enemies, either one, seeking to exploit a moment of apparent weakness. We have obviously a significant gang issue across the country, and under these circumstances, we're concerned that gangs may engage in raids on valuable inventory, either on premises or in transit. They may impose protection or extortion rackets in their area of operations. They may attempt to assert increased control over territory as the civil authority falters. Already, we go back now to the law enforcement presence. We already see many categories of minor crime that are simply not being enforced in certain American urban areas because of the lack of police officers on patrol and the overloading of the judicial system under these circumstances. We also have to look at individual acts of violence that may result from the psychological stresses that people are undergoing now, of isolation, unemployment, scarcity of goods, and their lack of preparedness, the impacts on their family, the conspiracy theories that are rife everywhere, and uncertainty about what lies in the immediate future. Just this morning, we had an interesting example of the train engineer out in Los Angeles who derailed his train 250 yards from the U.S. Navy hospital ship Mercy, and explained that he did this to draw attention to that ship, to wake people up to what was going on, quote unquote. It's unclear what conspiracy theory he was, promoting there, but if that's the case, there's a case of an individual going literally off the rails and nearly having a very significant impact. And of course, as time goes on, we'll look at an event like this and we'll say, was that in fact what happened here, or was this an act of terrorism? So basically, what we have here is a situation that is going to place you more and more reliant upon your own resources. Okay? We haven't seen a major uptick in crime or in civil unrest. We saw the deployment of National Guard troops into Westchester County, New York, a couple of weeks ago, and there was a great deal of concern about, what the reason for deploying National Guard was. And my response to one correspondent out there was, you're going to see them doing what they say they're going to do. They're going to distribute food to needy families and clean public places and provide all forms of assistance in a major outbreak. But I guarantee that the colonel in his orders packet, also was carrying instructions to be prepared to suppress civil disorder. I think that we will see some of these events in some areas around the country if current trends continue. So when we talk about active defense, I think this is becoming more important now than it was 6 months or a year ago, because all of these emerging threats and all of these trends are being accelerated and exacerbated by the situation that is developing, and the late or inadequate police response and their ability to protect you is going to affect that picture. So at that point, I will stop, and Mike, if you want to retake control.
Thank you, Bill. I'll go ahead and take over the screen. I assume you can hear me, comm check.
Loud and clear.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. Mike Smock here, co-founder, CEO of Distributed Security. I'm going to take a few minutes here and walk through some of the elements behind building an active defense within the enterprise. I want to start off with the notion of what we call security theater. Bill's done a very nice job of setting up some of the elements of what we would call security theater. And that term was actually coined by Bruce Schneer, a computer security specialist back around 9/11. And in Bruce's words, security theater are security measures that make people feel more secure, but don't actually do anything. And probably the most prevalent example of security theater that we see throughout enterprises today is the ubiquitous gun-free zone signs and gun-free policies that tend to be the stock and trade of human resource departments who really still don't quite understand what security is all about. There are many examples of security theater. Bill ran through most of them: gun-free signs, active shooter training that doesn't actually eliminate the threat, elaborate AI-driven technology that, again, doesn't stop the threat, and all it does is alert the authorities to show up, all kinds of infrastructure that theoretically might deter a potential threat, an active threat. But at the end of the day, violence ends up being the trump card. And all of these measures essentially are trumped by a determined attacker with a weapon and without the ability to immediately respond on site. You're essentially functioning inside security theater. The military has a nice definition of what an obstacle is and what a protective obstacle is. And in this case, protective obstacles do not provide protection by themselves. In tactical operations, leaders integrate protective obstacles with direct and indirect fire and observation. And this certainly applies to enterprises today. Back to the infrastructure and technology and the various policies. All of those are nice. All of those may have some impact, but unless you're able to immediately respond, then you're essentially helpless. Let's talk about active defense. And what we mean when we talk about active defense. Active defense is the ability to stop a violent threat, minimizing casualties and damage, and securing the scene prior to the arrival of law enforcement. Active defense utilizes enterprise employees who are highly trained, coordinated, and thoroughly vetted to form an armed security cadre. Now, when we talk about enterprise employees, as Bill indicated, the starting point is untrained civilians with no military or law enforcement background. We are not talking about dedicated guards. We're talking about marketing managers, production managers, HR staffers, call center employees who undergo training and then add security tasks to their day-to-day responsibilities. These individuals are thoroughly vetted and trained to work as a team in order to respond immediately to a lethal threat with lethal force. I want to talk quickly about ACES, and I think everybody on the phone call here, everybody who signed up is intimately familiar with ACES, the security industry organization. And we've spent a little bit of time with the folks at ACES talking about this. And for all of you with various ACES certifications, you'll know that the CPP certification is the one that probably gives you the most mileage. Within the CPP certification process, there are currently 7 different domains of knowledge that the person needs to master in order to receive the certification. In those 7 domains, they are learning about information security, investigations, crisis management, personnel security, business principles and practices, security principles and practices, and then physical security. But at no point is there any focus on actually mounting an active defense. I think there's a couple of folks on here from ACES. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, but I would say at this point that ACES, as far as their approach to guns in the enterprise and employees working with security in order to mount an active defense, is something that they are neutral on at this point. So within the construct of the CPP certification, at this point, there is no provision for mounting an active defense. And that's certainly not to diminish the benefit of the content that has to be mastered, but at the end of the day, unless you're able to immediately respond to that lethal threat with lethal force, then you're left to the authorities to respond whenever they're able to respond. In looking at ACES, one of the things that we have attempted to do is to line up the various domains that are mastered by security professionals via the ACES CPP certification, and then add to it an actual active defense capability. And as far as the active defense domain is considered, if you were to add it as a domain, we're looking at this from the standpoint of active defense actually being the foundation of enterprise security. In other words, active defense should be the foundational competency around which your security planning and your security budget is actually allocated. So if you were to take a look at the 7 different domains currently offered by the CPP certification, we would want to add an 8th one, which is active defense, and then take a look at that in terms of how active defense starts to influence or starts to inform your overall security planning and your security budget. As the old saying goes, from the standpoint of almost all of the efforts currently within the security industry, all of them result at the same endpoint, which is the need for somebody to call 911. And as we are seeing today, and as we have been seeing over the last 10 years, the ability of the authorities to respond in a reasonable time is diminishing. And as from the standpoint of where we are today going forward, that response over the next couple of years is certainly in jeopardy, at least at the levels that we have become used to. So what this all points to is the need for mounting an active defense within the enterprise. And the way that we start to look at this within the enterprise is through what we call a kinetic threat matrix. And with the kinetic threat matrix, what we do is we take a look at the overall threat environment, and then we line it up with the ACES domains, adding active defense at the bottom. And based upon the types of threats that an enterprise might be facing, that would influence the security allocations here, both from the standpoint of budget and resources. All of you will get a copy of this sent to you. The KTM is an interactive tool. It's designed to essentially allow you to war game. And very importantly, the way we looked at the kinetic threat matrix was from the standpoint of focusing on a single location, an enterprise within a single location. For example, a big box shopping outlet in downtown Detroit will face a different threat matrix than a sister location in Topeka, Kansas. The kinetic threat matrix is designed for BOGSAT sessions, a bunch of guys sitting around a table, and it's meant to be quickly updated and revised and allow people to, at least from a conceptual level, wrap their collective brains around what the immediate threats look like at their location. The program that you're going to get is Excel based. You'll be able to play with all the fields, change them, and well, play with it to your heart's desire. And the final output of the KTM is based upon the ACES security domains, where we take a look at the threat level for a specific location, and then based upon that threat level, allocate security resources and budgets in order to address it. And again, you will get a copy of this after the session. So, how do we create an armed proprietary enterprise security force? To start off with, active defense is the foundation. As stated above, active defense should be the starting point for your security planning. As the foundation of your security planning, then it has potentially will potentially influence how you start to look at all of those other passive resources and infrastructure that you utilize within the enterprise. So to start off with, as far as building that armed force, we start with the notion that active defense is the foundation of your security plan. From the standpoint of the types of security forces that organizing the forces and the various options out there, we have the obvious construct of contract versus proprietary. Everybody is aware here, contract is essentially outsourced services that are provided by a third party. Proprietary is in-house and involves the enterprise managing all their security functions in-house. That means that they may outsource some technology parts and pieces, but for the most part, all of that budget is maintained, allocated, and run by in-house security staff. So what we're looking at from the standpoint of building an armed security force is, first off, a proprietary force. And then second of all, taking a look at a couple of different variations on how you start to develop that proprietary force. Those variations are a dedicated force and a hybrid force. A dedicated force would be one where the enterprise hires full-time security personnel to do nothing but provide security. They might be uniformed, they might be plain clothes, they might be armed, they might be unarmed, but their only role is to provide security. What we're talking about here introduces the concept of the hybrid employee. This is an employee who already has a job within the enterprise, but now takes on the dual role of providing security. And from the standpoint of this approach, which I'll get into in a second here, we are taking that employee and training that employee up to what we call a basic SWAT competency. And we'll get to the couple of details about that here in a second. So from the standpoint of the types of security forces, we have the typical traditional breakdown of contract versus proprietary, and then within the proprietary option, a dedicated force and a hybrid force. Now, we're not saying we're necessarily against a dedicated force, but we do think that the hybrid force is better and can be more effective for many reasons, a few of which I'll get into here in a second. And then last but not least, an enterprise can certainly look at an integrated force that would take pieces of a hybrid and a dedicated organization and combine it with various contracted resources. So essentially, we're looking at three different types of force organization, and our focus here is on the hybrid force that involves training employees to provide that security. So in the end, what we're moving towards here is what we call the singularity within overall security functionality, and define it in terms of a marketing manager trained to basic SWAT competencies, carrying a Glock and a smartphone wired to cams, including the ability of receiving tactical communications over the smartphone, and all of this buttressed by robust tactical medical training, TCCC specifically, in order for him to be able to not only provide the lethal defense, but also take part in the triage and whatever medical needs may result from it. So when we talk about a hybrid employee, that's what we're talking about, moving towards a singularity where that professional employee is able to take part in a team and mount an active defense for the enterprise. So let's talk about reasons why you might want to do this. Why would you want to establish a proprietary force, and specifically a hybrid force using existing employees? First and foremost, the threat. We're in uncharted waters. We've been using this phrase for several years. I can tell you 3 months ago, that definition for us at Distributed Security had one meaning. Today, as we go through this webinar, based upon what's coming next, which nobody really knows, we truly are in uncharted waters when it comes to security. Need, again, cops won't be there when seconds count, to use the old trite saying, and this is not going to get better in the short term. This will only get worse. Cost, more than likely using a hybrid force, this could be a cheaper option than contract, and it can also be much more effective. Two other points here which are very important. When you're looking at a hybrid force using enterprise employees, you're going to be using individuals whom you know a lot about. And part of the vetting process and training process is finding those individuals. But when you're using enterprise employees, there will be a trust bond there that doesn't exist with contract third-party guards coming in, nor does it necessarily exist with just providing your own dedicated force. Last but not least, loyalty. A lot of enterprises still have employees who live in close proximity to the enterprise that they work for. They will be loyal to the enterprise, and from the standpoint of securing that enterprise having loyalty, having loyal employees doing it is you're going to find that to be much better than trying to hand it off to third parties. Now, of course, there's going to be a fair amount of pushback to establishing a proprietary force, specifically a hybrid force. People will say you can't train civilians. That's not true. The HR lady won't like it. She won't allow it. Well, employees don't want to do it. That's not true. The lawyer said no. Talked to Walmart in El Paso about what the lawyers are saying now. The insurance guy said no. Talked to many schools out there who are now seeing the lack of an armed capability being an insurance threat greater than that of having an armed teacher on premise. This will scare the employees. Well, that's true, but the employees are scared anyways. And what we want to do is begin to provide a level of competency and security for them where we start to alleviate some of that tension. And then last but not least, we quite often will hear, well, we're not certified or permitted by OSHA labor, Department of Labor, HIPAA, SHRM, whatever, choose your acronym there. They won't allow us to do this. And from the standpoint of just teeing up armed employees and letting them loose, that's probably true. But from the standpoint of the actual licensing and permitting process, all of these tend to be very local activities, all of which are fairly easily to obey and do within the context of the law. And the outlet here is always the ability to establish just a private security firm, for the enterprise to establish a private security firm and run all the operations through that. So there tends to be a solution for any sort of bureaucratic permitting or licensing obstacle that gets in the way. So how do you train ranked civilians to basic SWAT competencies? And I can see I'm quickly running out of time here, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. This is what we do for a living. The purpose of this webinar is not to give you a sales pitch. It's hopefully to give you information that you can react to. We certainly would be delighted to spend more time with you later on conference calls in order to start to introduce more of these concepts to you. But from the standpoint of the broad strokes, how do you train ranked civilians to basic SWAT competencies? And the answer to us starts with our methodology, which is training. And training for us equals instruction plus practice. And to give you some benchmarks here from the standpoint of our approach, we can take 6 ranked civilian employees, and over the course of 112 hours of on-range, on-site, and online training delivered over 6 months, we can train them up to a level where they are very competent team members capable of a coordinated response to threats that include working as a team and a squad on both a handgun and rifle, and bringing along the tactical, medical, and tactical communication skills. This approach, this initial 6-month approach, costs $72,000 and change from us. And as to the actual ongoing relationship, the ongoing practice, what we're typically looking at is a program that over 1 year would involve a total of 180 hours spread over 12 months. And at the end of that 12-month period, you now have 6 employees who are trained up to basic SWAT capabilities and have a highly effective capability to work as a team in order to put down a lethal threat. From the standpoint of how we do this, we spent the last 10 years developing intellectual property and various training plans. We have in excess at this point of 240 pieces of various intellectual property that would include videos, online learning management software, hundreds of training scripts, manuals that allow us to do this training. And we have training plans that can be configured for anybody from a basic individual who just wants to master concealed carry all the way up to what we're talking about today, which is the ability to train enterprise employees. So in summary, we're looking at the ability for an armed proprietary security force to provide the immediate defense to violent threats that almost every enterprise lacks today, and the ability to do it cost effectively and to do it with a high degree of assurance that you end up with a team that is capable and functioning. Embracing active defense will likely change your approach to security planning, resulting in lower cost and greater effectiveness. And this gets back to the ACES domain construct and turning that essentially upside down and looking at it from the standpoint of first, having active defense as your foundational competency, and then looking at the way that influences all the other various components that currently are budgeted and planned for in your security plan. And out of that, we think the ability of active defense will, as I said, result in lower cost and greater effectiveness. So that wraps up the content for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Leslie, who will complete the proceedings here. And we are right at, well, we're about 4 minutes over. Take a few minutes here for questions, but let me first hand it off to Les.